My insane mother-in-law took my newborn baby from me and gave him to my sister-in-law without my knowledge. I just found out how she did it, and I'm this close to making a decision that would land me 25 to life. I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. I married Michael 3 years ago, and his mother Helen has hated me since day one. I'm talking about the kind of hate where she'd accidentally spell my name wrong on Christmas cards and introduce me as Michael's friend at parties. Every family dinner was torture. She'd spend the whole meal gushing about Sarah, who's married to Michael's brother James. Michael always defended me, but you could see it wore him down. He'd come home from these dinners and just hold me saying, "She'll come around, baby. She has to." Then I got pregnant, and I thought finally she'll accept me. Michael literally cried when I showed him the test. 2 days later, James announced Sarah was pregnant too, and I swear Helen's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She threw Sarah this massive baby shower with ice sculptures. I got a Dead Battery musical card from the dollar store. Sarah had her baby first while James was traveling for work. Weirdly, Helen kept it quiet. This was the same woman who live-streamed grocery shopping and didn't post a single photo of her first grandchild. The day before my due date, Helen showed up with this herbal tea, said it would help with labor anxiety. I drank it to be polite and went into violent labor within hours. I woke up from an emergency C-section to Helen hovering over me acting concerned. She offered to help with the baby since I was recovering. Michael thought it was suspicious, but I was so drugged up I just wanted help. She started coming over daily with these special teas to help me heal. They knocked me out cold every time. Our son Thomas was sick from the start, constant crying and feeding issues. Nothing we did helped. Helen moved herself in claiming she needed to help with our special needs baby. She'd take over during the day posting about being super grandma while I handled every night feeding and doctor appointment. Meanwhile, she never shut up about how perfect Sarah's baby was doing. Then, she criticized me and told the whole family I was overwhelmed and failing as a mother. Michael worked 70-hour weeks to keep us afloat and came home to find me exhausted and confused every night. Thomas had been sick for so long. One day I suggested genetic testing, and Helen lost it. She screamed that I was giving up on him and looking for excuses to abandon my child. She demanded we switch doctors immediately. When I refused, she threatened to tell Michael I was having delusions. Michael walked in during the argument, and Helen immediately started crying, saying I attacked her. For the first time, my husband looked at me like he didn't know who I was. I secretly got the genetic testing done anyway and stopped drinking as much of her tea. When the results came back showing Thomas had a rare genetic condition, I felt validated for the first time in months. I wasn't a bad mother. My baby was actually sick. Michael apologized, and we reconnected over our love for Thomas. At the next family dinner, I confidently explained Thomas's diagnosis and treatment plan. Sarah kept trying to change the subject, and Helen gripped her wine glass so hard I thought it would shatter. Then Helen pulled out a folder, and my heart stopped. She had documented everything. Photos of our messy house, recordings of me sounding confused, statements from neighbors about my erratic behavior. She announced she was seeking emergency custody of Thomas for his own safety. Some family members actually looked convinced by her evidence. Michael defended me, but when Helen played a recording of me rambling while drugged, even he looked shaken. That night, I remembered something odd in the genetic test results about parental markers. I put in an order for further testing, and when the results came, the room started spinning. Thomas wasn't biologically related to me at all, and only 25% related to Michael. I didn't tell anyone, not even Michael. After months of being gaslit, I couldn't trust anyone. I called an emergency family meeting insisting everyone attend. Michael was confused but supported me. Helen arrived looking smug, probably expecting me to grovel. With everyone there as witnesses, I stood up and dropped the bomb about the DNA results. The room exploded. Michael stared at me, then at his mother in horror. Helen collapsed, clutching her chest. At the hospital, she thought she was dying and confessed everything. Sarah's baby was born with the same genetic condition Thomas has. Helen panicked about the family reputation. She came over and gave me something that induced my labor early. Then she switched the babies while I was unconscious from that tea she gave me. The healing teas were sedatives to keep me too confused to figure out the truth. The family was horrified. Michael and I raced to James and Sarah's house to get our real son back. Sarah wouldn't open the door. She screamed that she wasn't giving up her baby. Sarah kept saying we should leave things as they are since she'd already bonded with a healthy baby. We immediately got the lawyers involved. Our lawyers filed emergency motions while we sat in their conference room watching the clock tick. Michael gripped my hand so tight his knuckles turned white. The lead attorney spread out documents across the mahogany table, explaining jurisdiction issues and custody precedents. I stared at photos of 2 babies on my phone, one I'd raised for months who wasn't mine, and one I'd never held who was. Michael called James again, but it went straight to voicemail, the 5th time. We drove back to their house with a process server following behind. Sarah's car was gone from the driveway. The curtains were drawn tight. Nobody answered when the server knocked. A neighbor walking her dog mentioned she'd seen them loading suitcases that morning. The attorney called with updates every few hours. They'd filed for emergency custody hearings in 3 jurisdictions, since we didn't know where Sarah and James had gone. Michael paced our living room wearing a path in the carpet. I sat on the couch holding Thomas, who wasn't Thomas at all, while he cried from the pain his genetic condition caused. Helen was moved from emergency to a regular hospital room. The doctor said her heart episode was stress-induced, not an actual heart attack. Michael's aunt called to report that Helen was already backtracking, claiming the medication made her confused. She wanted to speak with her lawyer before making any more statements. I changed Thomas's diaper for what felt like the 1000th time, my hands moving automatically through the routine. This baby I'd fed at 3 a.m. for months, whose every cry I knew by heart, wasn't mine, but I was the only mother he'd known. My chest tightened watching him struggle to breathe through the congestion his condition caused. Michael's phone rang constantly. Family members who'd witnessed Helen's confession called with questions and theories. His cousin recorded part of it on her phone before hospital staff made everyone leave. At least we had that. Michael's uncle, a retired cop, recommended a private investigator who specialized in custody cases. The investigator met us that evening. He took notes while we explained everything from the beginning. He asked for Sarah and James's credit card numbers, phone records, anything that might help track them. Michael remembered James mentioning a cabin their family owned in the mountains. The investigator added it to his list of places to check. I pumped BR-assed milk and labeled it carefully, not knowing which baby would need it. The freezer was full of little bags dated over months of exhaustion. Michael found me crying over the pump at 2 a.m. He held me while I sobbed about failing both babies, the one I'd raised who was sick and the one I'd never met who was healthy. Morning brought more calls from lawyers. They'd gotten a judge to to issue an emergency custody order, but it was only valid in our state. If Sarah had crossed state lines, we'd need federal involvement. The FBI wouldn't take the case without evidence of kidnapping, which was complicated since Sarah was caring for her biological child, even if she'd obtained him through fraud. Helen's lawyer contacted ours. She was willing to provide a sworn statement about the baby switch in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Our attorney advised against it. We needed criminal charges to stick if we had any hope of getting our son back quickly. Immunity would undermine everything. The investigator called with a lead. James's credit card was used at a gas station 2 states away. They were heading toward James's parents' house in Florida. We packed immediately while the lawyers worked on getting emergency orders in multiple states along their likely route. Thomas had another bad night. His breathing was so labored I almost took him to the emergency room. Michael held him upright against his chest, the only position that seemed to help. I watched my husband comfort a baby that wasn't biologically his, while our actual son was somewhere on a highway with strangers. We met with prosecutors the next morning. They took our statements and reviewed the evidence. Helen's hospital confession, even recorded, might not hold up if she claimed medication-induced confusion. They needed more proof. The genetic testing helped but wasn't enough alone. They wanted hospital records from both births. The hospital administration stonewalled when we requested records. Their legal department cited privacy concerns and ongoing internal investigations. Our lawyer threatened lawsuits. They promised to review our request. Everything moved at bureaucratic speed while our baby got farther away each hour. Michael's brother finally answered his phone. James sounded exhausted and defensive. He said Sarah was hysterical, convinced we were trying to steal her baby. He believed Helen had been confused at the hospital, that no switch had occurred. When Michael screamed at him about the DNA evidence, James hung up. I found myself studying Thomas's face for signs of Sarah. His nose had her shape. His eyes were James's brown, not my green, or Michael's blue. How had I missed it? Helen's drugging had kept me too foggy to notice details that seemed obvious now. The guilt ate at me. The investigator tracked them to a hotel outside Jacksonville. Local police wouldn't intervene without proper documentation. Our lawyers rushed to file in Florida courts. I wanted to drive there immediately, but our attorney said showing up could be considered harassment, potentially hurting our case. Helen was released from the hospital. She went straight to her lawyer's office, not home. Michael's aunt reported she was telling everyone I'd manipulated the DNA tests because I couldn't handle having a sick child. Some family members who hadn't heard her confession started questioning our story. We hired a second law firm in Florida to handle the jurisdiction issues. The bills were mounting, but Michael said he'd sell everything we owned if necessary. His company gave him emergency leave. Neither of us could focus on anything except getting our son back and figuring out what to do about Thomas. Child Protective Services showed up at our door. Someone had reported concerns about Thomas's care. The social worker inspected our home and reviewed his medical records. She found nothing wrong but said they'd need to monitor the situation given the unusual circumstances. I realized Helen was behind the report. Our Florida attorney called with bad news. Sarah had hired her own lawyer and was filing for formal adoption, claiming we'd abandoned our biological child. The fact that we'd never had custody complicated everything. Florida judges were reluctant to disrupt a baby's placement without clear evidence of immediate danger. I spent hours researching similar cases online. Most took years to resolve. Some parents never got their children back. The legal system wasn't designed for crimes committed through manipulation rather than violence. Helen had orchestrated the perfect scheme, using our trust and her son's love against us. Michael broke down after reading about a case where biological parents lost custody because courts prioritized the child's attachment to the people who'd raised them. He blamed himself for not protecting me from his mother. I held him while he cried, both of us exhausted from grief and fear and rage. The prosecutor called with questions about Helen's behavior before the switch. They were building a timeline. I remembered every strange comment, every red flag I'd dismissed, how she'd insisted on being present for Sarah's delivery but not mine, how she'd pushed specific doctors and hospitals. It all made horrible sense now. We gave Thomas his medication and watched him struggle to keep it down. His condition required constant management, special formula, breathing treatments, doctor visits. Sarah knew none of this. Our biological son was probably being treated like a healthy baby, his actual needs ignored. The thought made me physically sick. The next morning brought a development that made my stomach drop. Sarah had posted on social media about her perfect baby boy, with dozens of photos showing a healthy, thriving infant. The comments were full of congratulations and heart emojis. Nobody knew she was raising my biological child while I cared for hers, a baby whose medical needs she'd abandoned. Michael discovered the posts first. His hands shook as he showed me his phone. There was our son, dressed in expensive outfits, surrounded by toys, looking content in Sarah's arms. She'd even posted about his amazing appetite and perfect health, clear signs she had no idea about the genetic condition that ran in her family. The investigator called with troubling news. James had withdrawn large sums from their joint accounts. He'd also researched international flight prices to countries without extradition treaties. Our window to act was closing fast. The investigator recommended we file additional motions immediately to freeze their assets and prevent international travel. Thomas woke up struggling to breathe again. His condition was deteriorating without proper management. The specialized formula he needed was running low, and Helen had been the one who knew which pharmacy carried it. I called every pharmacy within 50 miles trying to track it down while Michael held our sick baby upright. Our Florida attorney managed to get an emergency hearing scheduled, but Sarah's lawyer filed motion after motion to delay. They claimed we needed to establish paternity through additional testing, despite already having conclusive DNA results. Every delay tactic worked in their favor as Sarah established a stronger claim through daily caretaking. Helen started her own campaign. She called extended family members with her version of events, claiming I'd suffered postpartum psychosis and invented the entire switch story. She said the DNA tests were fabricated, that I'd been unstable since giving birth. Some relatives who'd always liked Helen began to doubt us. The prosecutor assigned to our case called with frustrating news. The hospital's internal investigation had concluded with no findings of wrongdoing. Several key staff members had suddenly retired or transferred, making them nearly impossible to subpoena. Without their testimony, proving the switch would be much harder. Michael's company started pressuring him to return to work. His emergency leave was running out, and we couldn't afford for him to lose his job with mounting legal bills. He started working remotely while I juggled Thomas's care and constant calls with attorneys. The stress was destroying us both. Then Sarah made a mistake. She took the baby to a pediatrician in Florida for what she thought was a routine checkup. The doctor noticed signs signs consistent with the genetic condition and ordered tests. Sarah panicked and fled the appointment before results came back, but now there was a medical record showing concerns. Our investigator used this information to track their movements. They'd left the hotel and were staying with friends in Georgia, trying to avoid detection. The friends had no idea about the situation and posted photos online that gave away their location. We finally had a solid lead. The emergency hearing in Florida got postponed when Sarah's lawyer claimed she had medical complications from childbirth. It was a lie, but we couldn't prove it without violating privacy laws. Another week lost while our son remained with strangers who didn't understand his medical needs. Helen escalated her attacks. She filed a complaint with Michael's employer claiming he was harassing her. She told neighbors we were dangerous, that she feared for her safety. When that didn't work, she started calling my family, trying to turn them against us with stories about my supposed mental instability. Child Protective Services made another visit. This time they had concerns about our ability to care for Thomas given the family disruption. The social worker took notes about everything: the medical equipment, the special formula, the exhaustion written on our faces. I knew Helen was feeding them information. The DNA testing company called with unexpected news. Someone had tried to access our test results using a fake authorization. When that failed, they'd attempted to have the results deleted from the system entirely. The company's security team traced the attempts back to an IP address associated with Helen's lawyer. Our Florida attorney finally got a hearing date that stuck, but Sarah's lawyer immediately filed an emergency motion claiming we'd hired someone to stalk and harass them. They had photos of our investigator's car near their location. The judge ordered us to cease all investigation pending the hearing. Thomas's pediatrician expressed serious concerns at his checkup. His condition was worsening faster than expected. He needed to see a specialist, but the earliest appointment was weeks away. The doctor wrote a letter emphasizing the importance of consistent, knowledgeable care for his condition, evidence that might help our case. Michael's mental health was crumbling. He wasn't sleeping, barely eating, and jumped every time his phone rang. He'd always been close to his mother before this, and her betrayal cut deep. He kept saying he should have seen it coming, should have protected us better. The guilt was eating him alive. Then came the call that changed everything. A nurse from the hospital where both babies were born reached out anonymously. She remembered that night because Helen had been acting strangely, insisting on being present for both deliveries despite hospital policy. She'd seen Helen near the nursery at odd hours, but hadn't thought much of it then. The nurse was terrified of losing her job, but agreed to meet with our lawyer. She brought security badge records showing Helen had accessed restricted areas multiple times that night. She also remembered Helen bringing gifts for the nursing staff, expensive coffee and pastries that, in hindsight, seemed like bribes. Our investigator, working within the court's restrictions, discovered James had been laid off from his job months ago. They were burning through savings paying for hotels and lawyers. Financial pressure might make them more willing to negotiate, or it might make them more desperate and unpredictable. Sarah posted another social media update, this time asking for prayers for legal troubles without providing details. The comments were supportive, offering help and sympathy. She was building a narrative where she was the victim, setting up public opinion in her favor before the truth came out. Helen's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter demanding we stop slandering her with false allegations. They threatened a defamation lawsuit seeking damages that would bankrupt us. Our attorney said it was an intimidation tactic, but the threat still kept me awake at night. The hospital suddenly announced a policy change regarding nursery security and visitor access. They didn't admit wrongdoing, but the timing was suspicious. Our lawyer said it was evidence they knew something had gone wrong, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Michael confronted his aunt, who'd been Helen's closest confidant. After hours of pressure, she admitted Helen had been planning something for months. She'd been obsessed with family reputation and horrified at the thought of a grandchild with a genetic condition. The aunt had thought it was just talk until the babies were born. We received notice that Sarah and James had enrolled the baby in a daycare in Georgia under a slightly different last name. They were settling in, creating a paper trail that showed stability and care. Every day that passed made it harder to prove the emergency nature of our situation. The prosecutor called with mixed news. They were building a case but needed more evidence. Helen's confession was problematic since she'd recanted. The nurse's testimony helped but wasn't enough alone. They suggested we focus on the family court case while they continued the criminal investigation. Thomas had his worst night yet. We ended up in the emergency room at 3 a.m., where doctors struggled to stabilize his breathing. The ER doctor said children with his condition needed consistent care from caregivers who understood their complex needs. I asked her to document everything for our case. Helen showed up at the hospital, somehow knowing we were there. She made a scene, claiming she just wanted to help her grandchild. Security had to escort her out, but not before several staff members witnessed her calling me an unfit mother. Michael looked ready to snap. Our savings were nearly depleted. Between lawyer fees, investigator costs, and medical bills, we were drowning. Michael's sister offered to help, but Helen had already poisoned her against us. She believed we were having a shared delusion, that the stress of a sick baby had broken us both. The family court hearing finally arrived. We flew to Florida, leaving Thomas with a specialized medical babysitter we could barely afford. Seeing Sarah and James in court was surreal. Sarah held my biological son like he was her most precious possession, while James avoided eye contact entirely. Sarah's lawyer painted a picture of devoted parents who'd been caring for a baby since birth. They emphasized the trauma of separation, the bond that had formed. They submitted photos showing a nursery they'd decorated, baby books they'd started, the life they'd built around a child who wasn't theirs. Our lawyer presented the DNA evidence and Helen's recorded confession, but Sarah's attorney argued we'd coerced a sick elderly woman, that the tests could have been tampered with. They requested independent testing that would take weeks we didn't have. The judge seemed sympathetic but cautious. She ordered supervised visitation to begin immediately while she reviewed evidence. It was progress, but painfully slow. We'd get 2 hours twice a week with our biological son while Sarah maintained primary custody. The first visit was heartbreaking. The baby cried when Sarah handed him over, reaching back for the only mother he'd known. He didn't recognize my voice, my smell, anything about me. I was a stranger to my own child. Michael held it together until we got to the car, then broke down completely. Helen hired a public relations firm. Suddenly, articles appeared in local papers about grandparents' rights and false accusations ruining families. She positioned herself as a victim of elder abuse, a grandmother kept from her sick grandchild by delusional parents. The nurse who'd agreed to testify received threats at work, anonymous calls saying she'd regret getting involved. She was so frightened she nearly backed out, but our our lawyer convinced her to document everything. The intimidation tactics were evidence of consciousness of guilt. Thomas was admitted to the hospital again. This time, doctors insisted on keeping him for observation. His tiny body was failing to thrive despite our best efforts. I slept in a chair by his crib, wondering if Sarah even knew her biological son was fighting for his life. During our second visit with our son, I noticed something odd. He had a small rash on his neck, the same type Thomas developed before his condition worsened. My heart sank. Our biological son had inherited the same genetic condition, but nobody treating him knew to look for it. I told our lawyer immediately. This changed everything. Our son needed medical care that Sarah couldn't provide because she didn't know about the condition. We filed an emergency motion based on medical necessity. Finally, we had an argument that wasn't just about biology, but about immediate welfare. Sarah's response was to accuse us of lying about the medical condition to gain sympathy. She claimed we were so desperate we'd make up illnesses, but the rash was spreading, and soon she'd have to face the truth her mother-in-law had tried so hard to hide. The investigator uncovered financial records showing Helen had paid cash for several large purchases around the time of the births. She'd also made significant donations to the hospital's foundation. While not direct evidence of bribery, it painted a picture of someone with means and motive to orchestrate a switch. Michael's cousin, the one who'd recorded Helen's confession, came forward with more information. She'd overheard Helen on the phone weeks before the birth discussing contingency plans if Sarah's baby wasn't healthy. The cousin had thought it was about medical care, not baby switching. We were granted an emergency hearing based on the medical concerns. This time, we came prepared with 3 specialists who testified about the genetic condition and the critical importance of early intervention. They explained how delayed treatment could cause permanent damage. Sarah broke down on the stand. She admitted the baby had been showing symptoms, but she'd been too afraid to seek proper medical care. She knew something was wrong but couldn't face losing another child. The truth finally came out that she'd miscarried twice before this pregnancy. The judge ordered immediate temporary custody transfer for medical evaluation and treatment. It wasn't permanent, but it was the first time in months I'd hold my biological son for more than 2 hours. He was so sick, much sicker than he should have been with proper early treatment. Helen made one last desperate move. She filed for grandparent rights, claiming we were alienating her from both children. She wanted court-ordered visitation and decision-making power regarding medical care. The audacity was breathtaking. The woman who'd orchestrated this nightmare wanted legal authority over her victims. The criminal investigation finally gained momentum when the FBI got involved. Because James had crossed state lines while fleeing with a baby, federal kidnapping charges became possible. The threat of federal prosecution made Helen's lawyer much more willing to negotiate. We spent a week in the hospital with our biological son while doctors worked to stabilize him. The same treatments that had helped Thomas would help him, but the delay in diagnosis meant a longer recovery. I pumped milk for both babies, finally able to nourish my own child. Michael had to return to work or lose his job entirely. He flew back while I stayed in Florida, juggling hospital visits with court appearances. We video called every night, both of us exhausted beyond measure but finally seeing a path forward. The prosecutor offered Helen a plea deal, full confession in exchange for reduced charges. She'd face jail time but not the decades that federal kidnapping charges could bring. Her lawyer advised her to take it. The wealthy grandmother who'd orchestrated this nightmare might finally face consequences. Sarah's mental health was deteriorating. She'd been calling the hospital demanding updates on her baby. James finally admitted she'd been struggling with delusions since the birth, convinced God had given her a healthy baby as reward for her previous losses. Helen had exploited this fragile mental state. Our biological son slowly improved with proper treatment. He started recognizing my voice, turning toward me when I spoke. These tiny victories felt monumental after months of separation. Michael flew back for the weekend and cried when the baby gripped his finger. The family court judge made her ruling. Full custody would be returned to us with a transition period to minimize trauma. Sarah would receive supervised visitation and mandated mental health treatment. The judge acknowledged the unique cruelty of the situation. 2 mothers who loved babies that weren't theirs. Helen's plea deal fell through when she tried to add conditions. She wanted guaranteed visitation rights and no financial restitution. The prosecutor withdrew the offer. She'd face trial for kidnapping, fraud, and endangering the welfare of children. Her wealth couldn't protect her from federal charges. We prepared for the journey home with our biological son. Thomas was being discharged from the hospital too, and decisions had to be made. Sarah was in no condition to care for him, and James was overwhelmed. The baby I'd raised for months still needed specialized care that few understood. In the end, the decision was simpler than expected. We couldn't abandon Thomas any more than we could abandon our biological son. With Sarah's consent and James's relief, we began the process to legally adopt the baby I'd raised from birth. 2 sick babies, both needing love and medical care. The flight home was surreal. 2 car seats, 2 diaper bags, 2 babies with the same genetic condition but different stages of treatment. Fellow passengers cooed over what they assumed were twins. In a way they were. Brothers bound by shared biology and a grandmother's twisted manipulations. Helen was arrested at her home the next morning. The news showed her being led away in handcuffs, her perfectly styled hair and designer clothes a sharp contrast to the orange jumpsuit she'd soon wear. Michael watched the footage once, then turned it off. Despite everything, she was still his mother. Our house felt different with 2 babies. The nursery meant for one became shared space for 2. We hired a night nurse to help manage their staggered medication schedules. Friends who distanced themselves during Helen's smear campaign slowly returned, offering support and apologies. The criminal trial would take months to begin. Helen's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence and delay proceedings, but the federal prosecutors were relentless. They'd uncovered more evidence of bribery and witness tampering. Her empire of manipulation was crumbling. Sarah entered a treatment facility specializing in postpartum mental health. James visited Thomas every week, slowly building a relationship with his biological son. He apologized repeatedly for believing Helen over us. The brothers who'd been turned against each other by their mother's schemes began to heal. We established new routines around 2 babies with special needs. Early morning breathing treatments, carefully timed medications, regular specialist visits. What seemed overwhelming at first became manageable with practice. Both boys began to thrive with consistent, knowledgeable care. The adoption process for Thomas moved forward smoothly. Sarah, in a moment of clarity during treatment, signed consent papers. She wanted him to stay with the only mother he'd known, the one who understood his medical needs. James supported the decision, knowing they could be part of his life without the pressure of primary care. Our biological son caught up developmentally eventually once his condition was managed. The months of delayed treatment hadn't caused permanent damage. He learned to recognize us, to seek comfort in our arms. The stranger who'd cried at our first meeting became our baby in every way that mattered. Helen's trial date was set. We'd have to testify, reliving the nightmare she'd created, but we'd do it to ensure she faced justice and couldn't hurt another family. The federal charges carried serious time. The grandmother who'd valued reputation above all would spend her remaining years branded a criminal. The prosecutor called at 6 a.m. with news that made me drop my coffee mug. Helen's lawyer had filed an emergency motion claiming she was mentally incompetent to stand trial. They'd gotten a psychiatrist to evaluate her who said the stress of losing her family had triggered a breakdown. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. I scrambled to find childcare for both babies while Michael rearranged his work schedule. The night nurse we'd hired had quit after Helen somehow got her phone number and called repeatedly at 3 a.m., making threats. Finding specialized care for 2 infants with medical needs on short notice felt impossible. Michael's cousin Catherine agreed to watch them, but she'd never handled their breathing treatments before. I wrote out detailed instructions while Michael demonstrated the equipment. Both babies needed treatments every 4 hours. Missing even one could trigger respiratory distress. The competency hearing was a circus. Helen arrived in a wheelchair she didn't need, wearing no makeup and mismatched clothes. Her usually perfect hair hung limp and unwashed. She stared blankly ahead while her lawyer argued she couldn't understand the charges against her. Our prosecutor wasn't buying it. She presented security footage from Helen's country club showing her playing tennis and hosting a charity luncheon just days earlier. The psychiatrist admitted he'd only evaluated her once for 30 minutes. The judge ordered an independent evaluation by a court-appointed expert. Catherine called during a recess. Our biological son was refusing his bottle and running a fever. She didn't know which medication to give or what dosage. I talked her through it while standing in the courthouse bathroom, trying not to panic about being 3 hours away. Helen's performance continued all afternoon. She mumbled incoherently when questioned and claimed not to recognize Michael. But when the prosecutor mentioned prison time, her eyes sharpened for just a second before resuming their vacant stare. The judge noticed it too. We raced home to find both babies screaming. Catherine was near tears herself. She'd mixed up their medications, giving Thomas the wrong dosage. His breathing was labored and his lips had a bluish tint. Michael called 911 while I held him upright, trying to help him breathe. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. They gave Thomas oxygen and nebulizer treatments in the ambulance. I rode with him while Michael followed with our other son who was still feverish and crying. Catherine apologized over and over, but I couldn't focus on anything except Thomas's oxygen levels. The ER was packed. We waited 4 hours for a room while juggling 2 sick babies. Other parents stared at us trying to manage double feeding schedules and medication times. A nurse finally took pity and found us a quiet corner where we could spread out all our supplies. Thomas stabilized after breathing treatments, but they wanted to keep him overnight. Our biological son's fever broke around midnight. Michael slept in a chair between both cribs while I pumped milk in labeled bottles. The hospital social worker stopped by to check on us. Another gift from Helen's anonymous reports. Morning brought a call from our lawyer. The court-appointed psychiatrist had evaluated Helen and found her completely competent. She'd tried the confused act with him too, but he'd caught her reading legal documents when she thought he'd left the room. Her competency hearing was dismissed. We were discharged with new prescriptions and stricter monitoring schedules. Both babies needed weight checks every 3 days. The stress was affecting their growth. I kept detailed logs of every feeding, every medication, every wet diaper. Evidence for court, but also the only way to keep track. Helen's trial date got pushed back again when her lawyer claimed they needed more time to review evidence. The prosecutor warned us this could go on for months. Helen was out on bail, free to continue her campaign while we struggled to keep 2 sick babies alive and healthy. Michael's job performance was suffering. He'd used up all his leave and was working odd hours between court dates and hospital visits. His boss called him in for a meeting. They were understanding but needed reliability. He had 1 month to stabilize his schedule or face demotion. Sarah was released from the treatment facility, but immediately relapsed when she saw photos of me with both babies. James brought her to our house unannounced, demanding to see Thomas. She was manic, talking rapidly about God's plan and how we'd stolen both her babies. We had to call police. The restraining order process meant more court dates, more time away from the babies, more legal fees we couldn't afford. The judge granted a temporary order, but Sarah would get a hearing to contest it. James apologized but stood by his wife. Family loyalty ran deep even when it hurt. Child services increased their visits to weekly. They said it was routine given the custody situation, but I knew Helen was still pulling strings. Each visit meant hours of preparation, making sure the house was spotless despite 2 babies who needed constant care. The stress was breaking us. Then the prosecutor called with worse news. Several key witnesses were backing out. The nurse who'd provided security footage had been transferred to another state. 2 hospital employees who'd agreed to testify suddenly couldn't remember important details. Helen's money was working behind the scenes. We hired a different investigator to look into the witness tampering, but that meant more expenses. Michael started selling things. His watch, golf clubs, anything valuable. I sold jewelry my grandmother had left me. Every dollar went to legal fees or medical bills. Nothing else mattered. Our biological son developed the same breathing problems Thomas had. The genetic condition was progressing similarly in both boys. They needed the same treatments at the same times. We moved their cribs next to each other so we could manage both simultaneously. They seemed to comfort each other. Helen showed up at the baby's specialist appointment. She sat in the waiting room like any other grandmother, telling strangers about her sick grandsons. When we came out, she tried to approach, but security intervened. She screamed about her rights while other patients stared. The babies cried from the noise. That night, someone slashed our tires. No cameras caught anything but we knew. The next morning, dead flowers were left on our doorstep with a note saying, "For the babies you called." Helen was escalating but staying just within legal bounds. The police said without proof they couldn't do anything. Michael installed security cameras while I researched restraining orders. The lawyer said we'd need documented threats, not just harassment. Helen was too smart for direct threats. She worked through proxies and anonymous messages, always maintaining plausible deniability while destroying our lives. The criminal trial finally started 6 months later. By then, both babies were crawling and needed even more intensive care. We tag-teamed court appearances so someone was always home. The prosecution's case was strong, but Helen's lawyers were better. They challenged everything. I testified for 3 days. Helen's lawyer twisted every word, making me sound unstable and vindictive. He brought up the postpartum postpartum period, the confusion from Helen's drugging, trying to establish reasonable doubt. I stayed calm, but inside I was screaming. The truth was so clear, but legal truth was different. Michael testified next. His mother sat there looking frail and confused while he described her manipulation. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but I saw her smirk when the jury wasn't looking. She was playing a role she'd perfected over months of practice. The nurse who'd provided security footage testified by video link. She was terrified but held firm under cross-examination. Yes, she'd seen Helen in restricted areas. Yes, the badge records showed unusual access patterns. No, she couldn't say definitively what Helen had done. Reasonable doubt crept in. During a recess, we got a call from the babysitter. Both babies were having severe reactions to their new medication. We rushed home to find them covered in hives and struggling to breathe. Another emergency room visit. Another night of terror. Helen's trial continued without us. The hospital kept them for 2 days. We missed crucial testimony from the DNA expert. Our lawyer said it went well, but Helen's team had their own expert who questioned the chain of custody. They suggested we might have tampered with samples. The lies were exhausting. We returned to court for closing arguments. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically. The hospital confession, the DNA results, the financial records, the witness testimony. It should have been enough. But Helen's lawyer spun a tale of a confused grandmother trying to help and being persecuted by unstable parents. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days of checking our phones constantly while managing breathing treatments and medication schedules. 4 days of jumping every time someone knocked. 4 days of pure agony waiting for justice that might never come. The verdict came on a Thursday. Guilty of custodial interference but not guilty on the more serious kidnapping charges. The jury believed she'd switched the babies but not with criminal intent. The sentence would be light. Helen smiled as they read it. She'd won even in defeat. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. The prosecutor warned us to expect probation, maybe house arrest. First-time offender, elderly, pillar of the community. The system wasn't designed for criminals who wore pearls and donated to charity. We'd gotten our verdict but not justice. Helen filed an appeal immediately. Her lawyers claimed jury tampering, prosecutorial misconduct, anything to delay. She was free pending appeal, free to continue her harassment, free to tell everyone she was innocent, free while we remained prisoners of the situation she'd created. The adoption of Thomas was finalized quietly. Sarah had stabilized enough to sign papers. She cried through the ceremony but said she was grateful he'd be with his brother. James held her hand while she said goodbye. It was heartbreaking but necessary. The boys needed each other. 2 weeks before Helen's sentencing, both babies were hospitalized with pneumonia. Their compromised immune systems couldn't fight it off. We lived in the pediatric ICU for 10 days. Shifts sleeping in chairs. Shifts watching oxygen levels. Shifts praying they'd keep breathing. Helen sent flowers to the hospital. The card said, praying for my grandsons, but the flowers were lilies. Funeral flowers. The nurse threw them out but not before I saw them. Even facing jail time, she couldn't resist one more twist of the knife. The boys recovered slowly. We brought them home the day before Helen's sentencing. They were weak but stable. Michael took the day off to attend court while I stayed home. I couldn't watch her play victim one more time. Couldn't hear her lies. Couldn't pretend the system would deliver justice. Michael called from the courthouse. 2 years probation and community service. Time served for the few hours she'd been in custody. A fine she could pay without blinking. The judge said she'd suffered enough losing her family, as if she hadn't orchestrated that loss herself. That night we sat with our boys, both finally sleeping peacefully after their evening treatments. 2 babies who'd survived Helen's cruelty, the system's failures, and their own medical challenges. They were fighters. We were fighters. Helen had taken so much but not everything. 6 months later, the appeals court upheld her conviction but reduced the sentence further. 1 year probation. She'd violated it twice already with drive-by incidents at our house, but her lawyer always got her off with warnings. The system protected her even after conviction. We moved to a smaller house in a different neighborhood. The legal bills had destroyed our savings. Michael took a second job. I worked from home between breathing treatments. We made it work because we had to. The boys were worth every sacrifice. Helen died of a stroke 2 years later, before her probation ended. Michael went to the funeral alone. I stayed home with our boys, now toddlers who called me mama and didn't know the story of their traumatic beginning. They were happy and as healthy as their condition allowed. The inheritance went entirely to charity, Helen's final manipulation. But we didn't need her money. We had our family, 2 brothers bound by more than blood, survivors of a grandmother's twisted love. They played together between medical appointments, neither knowing one had been stolen and returned. Some nights I still check the locks twice, still jump at unexpected knocks. The trauma lingers even with Helen gone. But then I hear my boys laughing and remember we won the only victory that mattered. They're together, they're loved, and they're ours.